I'm about to break these two parts, and they're identical except for one key difference. They're from the same sheet of fiberglass, prepped with the same sandpaper, and bonded with the same epoxy in a mold, so they should break around the same strength. What I didn't tell you is this first one was bonded 24 hours after sanding, while the second was bonded right away. If you want strong composite bonds, you have to prepare the surface as well. So how do you do that? Ask 10 composites technicians and you'll get 10 different answers. Some use high grit sandpaper, some use low, some claim isopropyl alcohol is all you need, and others use atomic oxygen generated by plasma discharge. I don't know what's best. I'm a guy on YouTube, so we're gonna test all those things in this video. I want strong bonds in my composite parts. The stuff I'm building has to survive past Mach 3. I'm talking attaching fins, gluing tubes, wet layups, dry layups, etc. If these bonds break, my rocket falls apart, so if there's a way to make them stronger, I wanna know. I've heard lots of advice from well-meaning engineers who all claim they have the best bond preparation techniques, but they all say something different, and I don't know who's right. And I know good preparation is important, but like, how important? Is good bond prep really 4 times stronger? The best way to learn is to simply test it yourself, so let's run the experiment. For this video, I ran almost 100 tests, pushing composite coupons until they broke using this hydraulic press. I measured that result using a load cell to make sure I knew as much as possible about bonding composites together using epoxy. This stuff comes in 2 parts, a resin and a hardener, and when you mix the two together, the epoxy begins to cure. And already before we've begun, we have a variable we need to control for: mixing. How well do you need to mix these two things together for the epoxy to cure fully? The epoxy I'm using here, Loctite E120HP, comes with mix nozzles that mix it for me. But are these really enough? The nozzle swishes these two liquids back and forth using baffles inside. Mixing it this way reduces bubbles, and it means you should be able to apply it directly to the parts. I'm not convinced though. Intuitively, it seems like hand mixing would be more thorough. So let's put it to the test. Let's run the experiment. I'll make 3 test coupons in 3D printed molds, then fill them with epoxy. One batch is epoxy right out of the mix nozzle, and the other batch uses a mix nozzle with extra hand mixing and a little black dye to differentiate them. Although, won't the black dye skew our results? Hold on to that thought for a minute. Each sample was broken in the middle by a point load, a piece of aluminum that I turned on the lathe. There we go, so 4,100 newtons on test sample 1. The ultimate strength for all of them was above 4,000 newtons. The average of the 3 mix nozzle samples was around 4,200 newtons, and the average of the hand mixing samples was around 4,600, about 7% better. So is it the black dye that increased the strength, or the mixing that increased the strength? Maybe the mixing went up 10% and the black dye reduced it by 3. This is the part of the video where I tell you that I am not an expert and these are not proper tests. Every number you hear in this video is real, but it's anecdotal evidence at best. It's not proof of anything definitive, and here's why. There are many uncontrolled variables in these tests, things like the black dye, side-to-side shifting of the load cell, inconsistent mix technique, etc. But most of all, for each data point in a test, we're usually averaging between 2 or 3 sample articles, while most standards and testing organizations would advocate for at least 5 or 10. I'm not making any of these numbers up, they're all real, but there's a big difference between lab-tested, peer-reviewed data and a guy making YouTube videos in his garage. What I'm here to do is gather a little more data to inform how I build my rockets, and when there are inconsistencies in my testing methodology, I'll try my best to call those out. So as we jump into this, be aware this data is incomplete and should be taken with a grain of salt. But there's still value in incomplete data, and salty food can be good from time to time. Our first test series will evaluate a wide range of bond preparation techniques, and we'll do 2 coupons with each of the following: no prep, 10 seconds of acetone wipe, 1 minute of acetone wipe, 10 seconds of IPA wipe, 1 minute of IPA wipe, then sandpaper in 60 grit, 120, 320, 600, and 1000 grit. After sanding, the surface is wiped clean using lint-free wipes soaked in 99.9% pure isopropyl alcohol. Each of these samples are cut from 1/4-inch fiberglass sheet. I selected this instead of carbon fiber because I had a bunch of it lying around, and it's a little bit cheaper this way. Some of this stuff has black dye in it, and some of it is green. This is an uncontrolled variable, and if we were in a lab doing proper tests, this wouldn't fly. But imperfect data can still have value, and since I'm filming this at the end of all the testing, I can tell you with decent certainty the green versus black fiberglass didn't make much of a difference. I cut out 2x3-inch coupons on the Carbide 3D Shapeoko, and after bond prepping them, I placed them in 3D printed molds to allow the epoxy to form into the shape that I wanted. The molds are coated in superlube with a long stick beforehand to act as a mold release so that the epoxy won't bond with the print. After labeling each coupon and putting the epoxy into the mold, I put each test article into the vacuum chamber to remove all the bubbles I could. It usually took a few iterations of this to get the epoxy to not bubble over the top of the mold and spill everywhere. Once cured, the superlube as a mold release kind of worked. It required some extra force to extract it every time, but nothing close to the breaking strength of the epoxy, so I wasn't too concerned. The cracks you hear in these clips are tiny pieces of epoxy fracturing, but most of the bond should be fine. Ooh. You might be wondering by now why we're setting up the test coupons this way. Most composite bond testing is run as single or double lap shear tests. That's where you take the two pieces and press the flat plates together, then pull them apart lengthwise and measure the stress and strain. Oftentimes this is done with a fancy machine called an Instron, and you're getting way higher fidelity data than anything we're doing here. But this cantilevered setup isn't very common, and my goal here is to emulate the actual scenario that I'm concerned about, which is a fin snapping off in flight. You can think of this as the body of a rocket and this as the fin of a rocket with some pretty chunky fillets. If this rocket gets a little silly at Mach 4 and it turns to the side, this surface will see a crazy amount of load, and that is what we're simulating. Looking at a cross-section, there's a little bit of everything in this test setup. There's some compression here, some shear here, some tension here. There's a little bit of tension and shear in this area. In hindsight, I wish I had run lap shear tests, because the failure mode for most of these tests was about the same. Each test broke at a different strength, but they all failed by either shearing off at this surface or breaking in some combo of tension and shear around that area. But hindsight is 20/20, and say it with me, imperfect data can still have value. Let's begin. With no bond prep, we get about 3,000 newtons and 1,800. With a 10-second acetone wipe, they both hit just above 3,100, and 60 seconds was a little worse, averaging 2,700. So maybe too much acetone can actually hurt performance. Keep that one on your noggin. IPA performed consistently well in both the 10-second tests and 60-second tests, averaging around 3,300 for both. Sanding is where it gets interesting. My first 60 grit sanding test performed excellent, averaging around 4,000 newtons. 120 grit had a little more deviation and averaged lower at around 3,600. Then it falls off a cliff. 320 grit had enormous deviation between 3,200 and 1,800 newtons. 600 grit averaged 2,900, and the single 1,000 grit test I ran was a pitiful 1,400 newtons. So what can we learn from this? First, I like how consistent the IPA was. Consistency is important, and we will come back to that later. Second, I'm impressed by the 60 grit strength, and there does seem to be an inverse correlation between the grit size and the total strength of the bond. It's pretty easy to look at this data and come to the conclusion that lower grits must perform better than higher grits, and once you get up to 1,000 grits, we're essentially polishing the part, so it's no surprise that it broke at a measly 1,400 newtons. So far, 60 grit seems to be our strongest performer, so let's dive deeper and find out why. I'm keeping each of these samples in bags with their associated shrapnel. I mean, the epoxy shards that come off. For one of the no-prep coupons, it's no surprise these didn't perform well. The glossy surface tells us this is an adhesive failure, i.e. the epoxy delaminated from the surface of the resin in the fiberglass. I do see areas where this isn't the case, which means we probably got lucky on the samples that performed well. I should also mention these parts are still covered in superlube. When I place them in the mold, I'm extremely careful to not let any of the superlube touch the surface. It's possible in all these tests that there's a little superlube contaminating the epoxy, but I largely doubt that this is the case. Looking at the 60-second IPA sample, we see two different failure modes. This is a cohesive failure, which means the epoxy itself broke and it left a little bit on the surface. And on the other piece from this sample, we have a substrate failure. That means the structural epoxy ripped off the top layer of the substrate, or the resin on the fiberglass. For the 60 grit sample, we can see a combination of these two. The epoxy shards are tearing away some of the surface resin resin from the fiberglass, and there's also still a little epoxy on the surface. Under a microscope, with the 60-second IPA on the right and the 60-grit sandpaper on the left, it's easier to see these two failure modes. For the IPA, we have this total delamination of the resin, so we can see the weave under the substrate, and the 60-grit surface is still rough, which probably contributes to a multimodal failure mode. For my worst performing sample, the 1000 grit, it looks like we had a real fast delamination on the bending piece of fiberglass, and this is consistent with the high-speed footage. The coupon just lets go with very little violence like we see in other brake tests. The top layer of resin almost looks untouched. It almost seems like we had some contamination on the surface, which is strange because I wiped it down with isopropyl alcohol after sanding. But let's take what we can learn from the 60 grit and see if we can get higher than that 4,000 Newton number. On the next round, I prepped 3 sets of dual samples, all with 60 grit sandpaper. The first set were sanded with reasonable pressure until the entire surface went from glossy to matte. This basically ensures the whole surface is fresh, so to speak, and I'm calling these 60 grit till gray. The second set was sanded with 60 grit sandpaper, but much harder this time. I pushed deep into the composite material, hoping to scuff up and expose some of those composite fibers. My thought was that maybe exposing some of those fibers would give us more area to bond with. The third set was sanded like the first. I sanded using moderate pressure until the piece was gray, but then I scored it with a knife. Maybe by allowing the epoxy to seep deeper into these grooves, we'll get a higher bond strength. Low grit sandpaper seems to perform well, so what if we just rough up the surface even further? For each of these samples, after cleaning with IPA, I pushed epoxy directly through the mix nozzle into the mold. Then I let them cure for 48 hours, and now let's break them. The 60 grit till gray averaged 2,750 newtons. The 60 grit hard sanding averaged about 2,100, and the 60 grit till gray with scoring averaged about 2,750, just like the first, though with a much wider deviation between the two samples, so we've got less consistency when scoring is involved. All 6 of these tests were far worse than the 4,000 Newton average from the first 2 60 grit tests. Something is consistently off here, and I think I know what it is. Vacuum degassing. During the first round of tests, I degassed in the mold, but I found that it made loading the epoxy much less consistent, so I neglected it on this more recent round. The vacuum chamber made the epoxy expand so much that it bubbled out and over the mold, which meant I had to refill the epoxy, then re-degas in a couple of steps until that stopped happening. So I tried this round of tests without it, which is another inconsistency, but that can be okay so long as we're aware of it. Skipping the vacuum step means the epoxy might have lots of tiny bubbles within it, and it's probably not mixing as well. So what can we learn from this round? First, vacuum degassing is important. I think that even if the mix nozzle is doing a good job and there aren't many air pockets, we're still getting further mixing when those bubbles come out through the vacuum degas process. If I had to guess, using my data alone, it looks like vacuum degassing can add as much as 25% strength into the epoxy. Further, hard sanding seems like it can reduce the strength of the bond. Sanding with a medium force until the surface is gray seems best, and although scoring can help, it can also hurt. There's a very wide split with the scoring results. And here we go again, talking about consistency. It's very important, and hand sanding makes consistency hard to get. So what if there's a method of bond preparation that doesn't require sanding? Whoa, did that guy just fall down a well? Hey man, are you all right down there?
Yeah.
Can you get yourself back out?
Sure, but it will take about 60 to 90 seconds.
Okay, and is there anything I can do to help?
The sponsor.
What?
Tell them about the sponsor.
You don't want me to call like the fire department, like emergency, sir? You know what? Sure, man. This video is sponsored by Crunch Labs. Half of why I make these videos is that I want more people to get involved in rocketry and STEM in general. We need more engineers if we're going to build a cool future, and I think a lot of folks are missing out on how fun engineering can be. Crunch Labs is doing a lot to help that, and if you don't already know, they have several monthly lines of STEM-themed projects like this. This is one of their newer offerings called Hack Pack, and it's focused on more advanced projects that involve robotics, coding, and experimentation. This project is the IR turret that shoots orange darts, and when building it, you get some hands-on experience with electronics. But at the end of the instructions, it's just the beginning of the goal for Hack Pack. That goal is experimentation. You can take the existing code that works online and start modifying it to behave differently, and this is entirely how I learned to code myself. You start from something that works and then change it until it does what you want. This whole thing is like a secret lesson in trial and error, and building resilience through that is a really important skill. Plus, each one of these boxes also gives you a chance to win a platinum diploma, which means free college tuition and a tour of Crunch Labs HQ. Whether you're an expert in the field or a beginner looking to just get started, a Hackpack subscription is a ton of fun, and they make fantastic holiday gifts if you're in that holiday shopping mood. You can get 15% off your first purchase of a Hackpack subscription by using the code BPS.space, and thank you so much to Crunch Labs for sponsoring this video. Now my buddy should be just about out of this well by now. At the very start of this project, I was secretly hoping to find a method of bond prep that didn't involve sanding, because for the larger rockets that I want to build in the future, that's a lot of surface area that needs to be bond prepped. And as I looked for solutions, something interesting showed up. I started finding details on the use of atomic oxygen to activate a surface for bond preparation, and boy oh boy, is this a deep rabbit hole you can go down. I think usually I'd avoid this type of thing, but this is a long video. If you've made it this far, you know it's gonna get weird. Let's go down the rabbit hole. Every solid has a surface energy, and we can think of this as how hungry that surface is to bond with other things. If you've seen water turn into beads on a freshly waxed car, that's because the wax has a very low surface energy, and from a technical perspective, that means the surface tension of the water is higher than the surface energy of the wax. But when the surface energy is high, the water wants to spread out a lot more. High surface energy objects aren't as common, so usually we have to do something to activate that surface. And to raise that surface energy, what we're gonna do is take all those happy bonds on the surface of a material and ruin their day. These bonds might be formed with oil and dirt and grease, and if they're completely closed, they're just not gonna be open to receiving anything new. We need to break as many of these bonds as possible so they can bond instead with the epoxy. Using solvents to clean off contaminants on the surface can break some of these bonds and raise the energy a little bit. Sandpaper breaks these bonds almost by definition. When we're etching until the surface is completely gray, we can be sure that we've etched away to fresh material. But there's another way to do it. You can also use plasma, and specifically the atomic oxygen that is generated within the plasma discharge. I promise not to get too deep into the weeds here, but atomic oxygen is crazy. Normal oxygen, like we're breathing right now, is O2. It's 2 atoms of oxygen bonded, but atomic oxygen is just one of them, and boy oh boy is he hungry. He's unstable and has high energy, and he wants to bond with literally anything that can get him to a lower energy state. When one of these guys runs into anything it can oxidize, it does, and it releases a lot of that energy in the process, which can break molecular chains around whatever it hits. This isn't just a bond prep thing. Atomic oxygen is a big challenge for spacecraft in low Earth orbit. There's a lot of atomic oxygen in the upper atmosphere, specifically in the thermosphere. Spacecraft in orbits around there are getting slowly eaten by atomic oxygen constantly. So back to bond prep. We can use this atomic oxygen to etch away the material at a molecular scale, but we're also cleaning it. The hungry oxygen atoms want to bond with everything, which means they'll bond with oil, dirt, any contamination, and they'll carry it away. Atomic oxygen is incredible because it's like we're sanding and cleaning with IPA at the same time. So, probably don't try this at home. High voltage is very dangerous, but if we take a high voltage source and create an arc across 2 leads, that arc is going to be made of plasma. And the concentrated energy within that plasma is enough to break apart and dissociate the oxygen in the air around it. So we've got some atomic oxygen in there. Then, if we take a vacuum hose and hook it up to the outlet of a vacuum and blow air across that arc to force it down these long steel leads, we aren't just lengthening the plasma, we're making it last longer, and we're also blowing that atomic oxygen out the end of this gliding arc. This is called gliding arc discharge, and it, kind of worked. You can test surface energy using a water break or contact angle test, and we've done this in past videos before. By putting water droplets on the surface of a material that you've just recently prepped, if the water spreads out and has a very low break angle, that means the surface is pretty active. It has a high surface energy and it's ready to bond with. I used contact angle tests to measure the results of the gliding arc discharge setup, and I could never get consistent results. Sometimes I managed to get good results, but that was only after 10 or 15 minutes of consistent application to the same spot. That's not a very high potency for bond preparation, and in terms of the time involved and the size of the parts that I'm working with, sanding an IPA is going to be way faster. I'm also not stoked about the idea of adding kilovolts of electrical potential to my bond prep process, so I think we need a new approach. Generating plasma using electricity is one way to go about it, but you know what else is plasma? There's a bit of atomic oxygen within this, as well as other reactive species that can help break apart the hydrocarbon chains within the resin of the composite you're trying to bond to. That's going to raise the surface energy just like gliding arc discharge. That's enough, thank you. We can see the effect of this not just through contact angle of water droplets, but with these Dyn test pens that are designed to wet out at different surface energies, letting you know just how effective bond prep was. After slowly treating the bottom half of this fin with a few passes of a butane torch, the pens clearly indicate the transition from low surface energy to high surface energy. The obvious downside here is heat. While gliding arc discharge is a non-thermal plasma, so it can't burn the part, this is pretty thermal. Most epoxy resins aren't rated to anywhere near this temperature, so for this to work, you need short, fast passes at a controlled distance from the part. And if you get that wrong, even a little bit, you will burn off the top layer of resin, compromising the strength of the substrate, and probably scrapping the part entirely. This smoke means you're not going to space, and I viewed the flame treatment as a little too risky for me. If the options are kilovolts of electricity, an open flame, or sanding, I'm gonna pick sanding every time. Something I've always heard is that you need to prep the surface you're bonding to as close to the bond time as possible. I've been told that if you wait more than a few hours between prepping and bonding, you're giving up a lot of potential strength, and I believe this. You can find lots of published data that supports this idea, but lab data isn't always representative of your particular situation, and I'd love to find those numbers myself, so let's do it. Let's run the experiment. We're going to prep 16 samples tested in pairs at discrete times: 74 hours, 49, 24, 7, 3, 1.5, and immediate bonding. Leading up to the bond, I prepped each sample at the right time so that I could glue them together all at once. After sanding each sample, I wiped it clean with isopropyl alcohol, then let it sit in the corner of my garage until it was time to bond. I didn't do anything else in the garage during testing, so the environment should be free of mold release, cutting fluid, machine oil, or other contaminants. I mixed the epoxy extra good in a cup beforehand with a drop of black dye, then vacuum degassed it in the cup. Then I poured that epoxy into each mold and vacuum degassed again to try and get the most consistent performance from each sample. These samples should be absolutely identical apart from two variables. The first is the time between the prep and the bond. That's the variable we're controlling for. And two is the sanding itself. You can't hand sand something the same exact way every time. And in an effort to fight this and get more consistency, about halfway through the testing I switched to an orbital sander, which provides, hopefully, more consistent results. I regret doing this in hindsight as it tarnishes the data I was hoping to capture, but if we see a significant change between the orbital sander and hand sanding, we'll kind of know what's up there. And that's enough yapping from me, let's break them. All right, at 74 hours, we've got 2600 and 3500, averaging 3100 newtons. At 49 hours, we have a wider split with an average of 2700, and at 24 hours, we have an extremely wide split averaging 1900. That lower bound is our worst result yet at 1100 newtons, which is worse than the 1000 grit sandpaper. Ouch! If what I've heard is true, as the prep to bond time goes down, the strength should go up. So it makes sense to me that these early results aren't great, but let's keep going. At 11 hours, we have two solid results averaging about 3,500 newtons, and at 7 hours, another two strong ones averaging 3,300. At 3 hours is where I switched to the orbital sander, and we have a big split between 1,700 and 2,900, averaging 2,300. At 1.5 hours, we have a smaller split averaging 2,750, and the immediate bond test dropped to an average of 2,300. These results are very messy, but I think we can still learn from them. First, I don't think there's enough data here to draw any strong conclusions. Straight up. There's just not enough statistical significance when each test only has 2 samples. If we're looking for trends, we should be careful not to look too closely. When I set up this test, I was A, hoping for more consistency in the results as a whole, and B, hoping that we'd see a way clearer correlation between the time between prep and bond and the strength of the bond. That's why I felt okay running 2 samples per test, but I do think there's still a little bit we can learn from this. While I don't see trends, I still see possibilities. It is obviously possible to get a strong bond with 74 hours between your prep time and your bond time. And in the same vein, it's obviously possible to get a weak bond if you bond immediately. There are lots of factors at play. This should be obvious by now. If I squint and look for trends, it does seem like the orbital sander is less consistent, especially because we'd expect the more recent results to be stronger than these. And it's kind of hard to ignore that a lot of the data after 12 hours is all over the place. This data is incomplete and it's imperfect. It still has value, but we should be really careful not to draw strong conclusions from it. What we should do instead is collect more. I started to think a little harder about how the orbital sander works, and it's in the name. It sands in an orbit with tiny little swirls. The sander vibrates while rotating the sandpaper, and that creates lots of little swirls on the surface. For hand sanding, I had largely moved my hand back and forth in straight lines. The difference here is that with a large enough area and a distributed load, the orbital sander probably leaves a flatter surface overall, whereas hand sanding cuts deeper grooves. It's as if the orbital sander is creating tons of micro scratches in a uniform surface, whereas linear sanding cuts deeper and likely results in more surface area for the epoxy to bond with. I might be falling for the coastline paradox here, and that's always how I've heard it described from experts in composites manufacturing. The surface may look smoother, but it actually has more ridges and, as a result, more surface area than a rough surface. It's just rough at a microscopic level, which means it could be more surface area than a low-grit sandpaper. But once again, if we want to know the answers, let's just run the experiment. I made 3 more coupons that I linearly sanded hard with 60-grit sandpaper. If the orbital sander seems to make it worse, maybe linear sanding is the key to getting back to that 4,000 Newton number, so we'll do that by pressing hard with 60-grit sandpaper. Every time I do these tests, I'm using brand new sandpaper to reduce contamination. That's important, so I'll say it again. Every time I run a new series of tests, not necessarily when I make a new coupon, I get a new piece of sandpaper to reduce contamination. This is foreshadowing, but I bet it's not in the way that you think. I kept the sanding direction mostly consistent, aiming to create deep, straight grooves, then I wiped each surface off with IPA to clean it. I then mixed up another batch of Loctite E120HP with a bit of black dye, and vacuum degassed in the mix cup before pouring it into the mold. I was burnt out by this point, so I skipped the step of re-degassing the epoxy while it was in the mold. This is another inconsistency, and if these results perform well enough, I figured I could rerun them with more degassing. This is also more accurate to the way I'll be bonding fins onto my rockets. These fillets will be big enough that it'll be hard to degas the epoxy once it's on the surface, but all of this assumes I ever find a good solution here. So let's fast forward and break these samples. These 3 samples are all identical with consistent preparation, cleaning, epoxy, degassing, etc. And yet the only thing we are consistently doing is falling well short of that 4,000 Newton number from the early 60-grit tests. And the spread between them is wide. With 3,300, 2,900, and 1,900 Newton breakpoints, this is not good. Next, I followed some logic from my original testing, which seemed to indicate that lower grit sandpapers perform better. We've been messing around with 60 grit, let's go lower. How about 40? The nice thing about lower grit sandpaper is it goes a lot faster. There are really big grooves that are created here, and so we etch away a lot more surface area every time we move the paper across. It might be a win-win. Maybe this is how we do big composite parts. Just as always, after sanding, I wiped the surface clean using lint-free wipes and high-grade isopropyl alcohol. Then I mixed up another batch of epoxy with a little black dye, degassed in the mix cup, poured it into the mold, then re-degassed in the mold to get as much strength as I could. I was hopeful and trying with every technique I knew to get back to that 4,000 Newton number, and when the epoxy had cured for 48 hours... Oh, wait. Sidebar, all of these tests were run 48 hours after bonding. That is a variable I controlled for. The epoxy should cure to full strength within 24 hours, but 48 gives us a little bit more margin. Okay, sidebar over. After demolding the 40 grit samples, I loaded them up and let it rip. So it's like a little better. We've got 3,000, 2,800, and 3,400, but 60 grit has outperformed these results plenty of times. I'm not really sure that we can call this better. I think I need to give this one more really good shot. We need to pull all of the stops and give these tests every opportunity to succeed and get back to that 4,000 Newton number. I'm gonna prep 3 more samples, and they're each gonna use 60 grit linear sanding until the surface is completely gray. Then I'm gonna thoroughly wipe it down with high-grade IPA on a lint-free wipe, switching the sides of the wipe periodically to not reintroduce old contaminants. I'm starting to run out of fiberglass, so 2 of these are black fiberglass and 1 is green. As previously mentioned, while this is an uncontrolled variable, I haven't been able to find any correlation between the strength and the color of the fiberglass. To explore every option of getting a stronger bond, I also shortened the time between the epoxy mixing and the bond to the surface to a single-digit number of seconds. I dispensed the epoxy directly through the mix nozzle into the mold, and then I vacuum degassed once it was in the mold. Then I left the mold for 48 hours, knowing I had given this batch every chance that I could at working. With breakpoints at 2,600, 2,250, and 3,200 newtons, we are not back. It is so f***ing over. That's an average of 2,700 with a wide deviation, and once again, it's nowhere near that 4,000 newton peak. I'm starting to think we're trying to solve this in the wrong way, though. That maximum strength of 4,000 newtons with 60 grit sandpaper was good, but it's clearly not replicable, at least not consistently. I must have etched it in like the perfect way, or used like the best possible batch of Loctite. Oh shoot, okay, hold on one sec. All the epoxy is from the same batch. It's all Loctite E120 HP, and although I switched to a bunch of different cartridges, I purchased a large order of this stuff at the very start and ensured that the label for the batch number on each cartridge was exactly the same. So even though the cartridges are different, the Loctite like batch number is exactly the same. So it's probably as close as I can get to maintaining batch consistency. Okay, sidebar over. We aren't getting back to 4,000, and if we do, I don't think it's valuable because we can't do it consistently. I'm trying everything I can at this point in the project, and I can barely get these samples to break 3,000 newtons, just 75% of our theoretical and demonstrated maximum. I mean, just by the numbers, the IPA alone, no sanding, is performing better. So like, maybe there's something I'm missing here. Around this time, I went over to a friend's house to hang out by a fire and meet some new folks. I was complaining loudly about how I couldn't get good composite bonds, and some dude I had never met chimed in and said, "Just use acetone and IPA." Frustrated and thinking he didn't know what he was talking about, I shot back that in my experience, 60 grit sandpaper had performed better than IPA or acetone. He doubled down and said you need to acetone first, then you have to come in and clean up the residue it leaves with IPA. I told him that sounded good in theory, but I had real numbers to back up my 60 grit sandpaper. By this point, I had heard a lot of people claim that they knew the best techniques for composites without ever backing them up. And then he told me where he worked, and then I stopped talking. I had accidentally fought the dude in charge of bond prep for composite structures on an orbital launch vehicle, and not just any orbital launch vehicle, but one certified for national security space launch. I won't tell you which company it is, but it's a pretty short list and an awfully hard certification to get. Specifically, I learned that when getting certified to fly national security missions, the US government was very interested in companies and assembly lines that are robust to the loss of skilled labor. And to put that in simpler terms, if the quality of your composite bonds relies on some old technician with perfect sanding technique, when they leave, can someone else do it just as good? When the government spends $50 billion on a spy satellite and puts it on a rocket, that rocket has to work, regardless of who works at the company, or who quit, or who recently took their place. If your goal is reliability and consistency, it does not matter what maximum strength you can achieve. It matters what strength you can achieve every time. Acetone and IPA is how we get that. When working with 60 grit sandpaper, I was able to achieve an extremely strong bond, but I could never do it consistently. If a bond fails at 4,000 newtons one day and 1,000 newtons the next, I have to design my rocket around the 1,000 newton number, and we just have a bunch of this goofy margin above there that never gets used. So after one of the most humbling experiences of my life talking with this expert, I drove home excited to try a new bond prep method. Here's the plan. I cut out a new series of test coupons, and we're going to run 11 tests. First, we're going to do 4 coupons that are straight up what the expert said. No sanding, just 10 seconds of wiping with acetone, and cleaning it after with IPA. I'm using regular paper towels for acetone, and the IPA is done with a lint-free wipe to reduce debris. Technically, you should do lint-free for everything, but this is a YouTube video, not a research lab. The theory here is that as the stronger solvent, acetone will eat away more of the surface contamination than IPA. It also slightly dissolves the top layer of resin in the composite, which is good in moderation. That helps open up some bond sites in both pieces, but it can also degrade the top layer of each composite, so the acetone should only be used in short durations, which is why I'm limiting that wipe to 10 seconds. If the acetone pools on top for longer than 3 to 5 seconds after wiping, you'll start to damage that top layer of resin, and this is likely the cause of some of the low results with long acetone wipes I did in earlier tests. Coming in with IPA after the acetone will further help clean up residue from dissolved oils and contaminants. Sometimes these aren't fully removed by the acetone because of how fast it evaporates, and wiping them off with a lint-free wipe and IPA will further clean the area. For these first 4, I hand-mixed a batch of epoxy, degassed it in the cup, poured it into the molds, and then re-degassed the molds before letting it cure. For the next 3 coupons, I'm going to run everything the same except for one step. We're not going to vacuum degas in the cup, we're dispensing the epoxy through the mix nozzle directly into the mold. My hope here is that once again we'd find some extra strength by depositing the freshly mixed epoxy right onto the surface within a single-digit number of seconds. Finally, we should compare this with some sanding. So I hand sanded 4 more coupons with 60 grit sandpaper. I did this with moderate strength, linearly, mostly back and forth until the surface was gray. Then, after sanding, I cleaned that surface with acetone for about 10 seconds, then came in with IPA and wiped it off just like all the other samples. And for the epoxy, I mixed it up in a cup, degassed the cup, poured the epoxy into the mold, and then re-degassed the mold before letting it cure for 48 hours. Folks, the results are in. We're looking for consistency. Let's see if we got it. For the straight acetone and IPA wipe, we've got 3350, 3200, 3000, and 3260. Awesome, all in the same area. For the fast bonded acetone and IPA wipe, we have 3000, 3200, and 3250. Same ballpark, no huge difference in strength. So bonding immediately versus 15 minutes after mixing had no real effect. And finally, for the 60 grit sanded with an acetone and IPA wipe after, we have 3260, 3230, 3200, and 3000. Interestingly, at least for my tests, sanding did not meaningfully improve the strength, and this is great news for me considering I was getting pretty tired of doing it. The standard deviation of these coupons was lower than any other test series I ran, and that means it worked. Acetone and IPA achieved the consistency that the tech claimed it would. It seems like this is really the trick to getting repeatable bond strength, and it is remarkable how close I came to figuring this out during the earlier series of tests. In many of these runs, I was sanding and using IPA right after, but I wasn't doing acetone beforehand. Maybe the sandpaper I used had a strong enough mold release on it that the IPA couldn't get rid of it. That might explain some of the huge deviations in earlier tests. And maybe my fresh sheets of sandpaper weren't that fresh after all. If these sheets were contaminated with just a little bit of oil or grease, these results would start to make a lot more sense. This is especially true because I picked fresh sheets of sandpaper before every new test series, but not before every test coupon. So for example, on the 320 grit test, I used the same sandpaper between the first and second coupon. Whatever contamination was picked up by the sandpaper after the first coupon probably made it onto the second, which would explain the low result here. And there are several other examples of sandpaper reuse that have wild differences in their results. I want to run this series of tests again, but differently. Now that I can achieve a consistent bond strength, I want to go back and rerun that prep to bond time series of tests to see if we can find that curve in the data. I also want to retest different grits of sandpaper because I have a sneaking suspicion that higher grit sandpaper is actually better, but I just couldn't see it given the noise in my testing. Rocketry as a hobby is filled with people claiming they know the right way to do something, and sometimes they do. Every now and then, some anonymous engineer posts on a forum with deep knowledge about a topic, and we all become smarter because of it. But it can be hard to tell when someone knows what they're talking about versus when they're making it up. The only way to know any of this stuff for sure is to run the test yourself, and the bar is usually pretty low to get the answers you want. It has never been easier, and I mean it. Do you have an idea for what you'd do differently in this bond test series? Look at this, for $60 with some ratchet straps and a little creativity, you can do the same type of test setup that I did and run the experiment yourself. At the same time, there are tons of peer-reviewed resources online that will tell you all the things that I tell you in this video, but more detailed and more trustworthy. The value in that data is enormous, and I don't mean to downplay it, but there is no data like your data. Run the experiment. All this testing happened over a year ago in the summer of 2024. I sat on this footage for a while because I didn't have the time to put it together until now. I was also a little embarrassed at the amount of testing I went through to find out something I probably could have learned with a few more Google searches. But I gained a lot more understanding through this process, and it was certainly worthwhile. Sometimes these projects take me a long time to edit and then publish. Like right now I'm working on a payload deployment device, a new nose cone, and a couple of end motors, but those won't be out for at least a month because they're not done yet. If you want real-time update videos every 2 weeks, I post behind-the-scenes footage of all the designing, building, and testing that I do on the BPS Patreon. That is how this project is funded, and I want to give an enormous thank you to the generosity of the folks over there. Specifically for this bond testing project, it did not take a short amount of time to complete, and it was not always easy to keep going, but their generosity and support allowed that to happen. Thanks again to the folks over there who know that progress isn't always linear, and thanks to you for watching this enormous video. I'll be back soon with another one. My name is Joe Barnard. May your skies be blue and your winds be low. Goodbye.